I am this close to crashing out. I watched this clip this morning from Professor David Starkey. Obviously, Professor Starkey and I had a long chat recently, and at the end we said we're happy to do a part 2. And right at the end, I asked Professor Starkey if all of the interesting philosophical and historical conversations we had were relevant if my generation were majority non-British. And by British, I mean English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. By Ancestry, obviously. And he said no. So he said that if Britain becomes minority white British, minority native, then all our pontifications on whether we're somewheres or anywheres, whether or not we can create a bicultural identity between the English and the Celts, whether or not we can have a public-private distinction between different denominations of religion, all of it's for nothing. And so then Professor Starkey went and did an event in Beaconsfield for the New Culture Forum with Mark Littlewood. Mark Littlewood, who used to run the Institute for Economic Affairs and then has now founded Popular Conservatism, attached to the Conservative Party, which is neither popular nor conservative. And I've met Mark, and I don't wish to be disparaging, but he always seems to operate at the level of abstractions, like only ever talking about twiddling the economic dials to improve material conditions. But when you bring him onto the thornier issues of identity and ancestry and ethnicity, you know, the sort of issues that create a pre-political we, a constituency in whose interest you perform politics, such as adjusting tax rates or building infrastructure, he recoils, or he goes, well, you know, that's sort of besides the point. And it's not, it's at the core of the point. Whereas, you know, I'm not an economist, but I'm happy to talk about economics and admit my limited knowledge when I run up against something I don't know, but I will still engage with the topic. And so it's frustrating to have watched this clip this morning, where Professor Starkey reverts straight back to these unworkable fictions about mapping the bicultural identity between the Celtic nations and the English onto completely different peoples and foreign cultures that have been imported here without any democratic consent, that don't share any of the fundamental assumptions that both the English and the Celts shared, because they were indigenous people of the British Isles. They're basically the same ethnic groups with high levels of crossover. They had the same foundational religion, despite different denominations, you know, Anglicanism, Catholicism, Presbyterianism. They share the same geographic climate and very low levels of cousin marriage. All of those things are shared, and they create a kind of psychological foundation for negotiating our identities with relative peace. And in this clip, they both seem to agree, with lots of nodding and yes, very clever, that we can just map this onto Indians and Pakistanis and Africans and Sikhs and Hindus, and just I'm going to play it and we'll go through it.
So before we go over to questions, David, there's another issue which has flared up somewhat in the media, and I think is important for us to get our head around and have an answer to. I think we're still going to need to evangelise at grassroots level and definitely at senior policy level about this idea that we need this complete constitutional reset, that if the UK was a computer, we basically need to go into the settings and reset it to about April 1997, whilst making sure that the European Union app remains off it.
Just sticking with that analogy of hardware and software, you can't download iOS 10 on a Nokia brick. So it's all well and good to talk about our cultural software, our constitutional settlement, which religion or none, as David Starkey would prefer, we should follow, as long as you're talking about the same hardware, the same people. And softwares are developed for hardwares, are basically exclusive to hardwares. So you can't download the English cultural, legal, constitutional software onto Pakistani hardware, Indian hardware, African hardware. You might be able to jailbreak the occasional bit of hardware with great effort, but it's a bit like the guy that beat Dark Souls using a Rockstar drum set, or the guy that beat the Crota raid from Destiny 1 using a potato. Like that's an awful lot of effort to go through to make something that is that is not intended for the purpose that you're using it for to work, you're better off just using the hardware that is intended for the software.
I think we've made progress there, but we haven't put the ball directly in the net yet. But what's interesting is that in some areas, it's not necessarily mainstream discourse yet, but it comes up in some discussions. An argument is developing about, all right, well, what is Britishness? Right? So let's roll forward and reject your pessimistic thesis. Let's assume that a government comes in and does this constitutional reset and restoration. And the flowers start blooming again in the Valley of Death, and the crops start growing, and people feel more optimistic. And
the lion lies down with the lamb.
And the lion lies down with the lamb. All of that stuff. But there seems to be a division about what counts as British. So we've had, for example, what's his name, Charlie Downs, Rupert Lowe's main man, being asked by Nana Acquire on GB News, Nana Acquire saying, well, are you saying I'm not English? And he sort of ducked and dodged the question. You've got Shabana Mahmood.
No, Nana Acquire is not English. She's born of Ghanaian parents in Newcastle. She has a British passport, but she's a Ghanaian woman. Like, she's nice enough. But back in 2021, there was a short-lived social media platform called Getter, and I got invited to the launch party. Carl Benjamin was there, a few other people. And I first met Nana. I hadn't been on the show at that point. And she was a little bit drunk, but we were talking about why, basically, she was right-wing. And she said, well, I voted Brexit because I didn't want to be governed by the European Union because none of those people look like me. And it's like, okay, well, I don't have that concern because I'm not black, because I'm not African. Because my parents are both British. Like, my mum's half Irish, my dad's English, I've got like a French ancestor somewhere. But that's not really a concern of mine, because I don't feel not represented on the grounds of skin colour by the European Union. I don't feel represented because they're a faceless bureaucracy that doesn't share my political priors or my vision of the good. But those aren't the foundations from which I'm arguing. And the only reason she is arguing from those foundations is because she isn't English. And that's fine, doesn't make her a bad person, but it means that there are intractable tribalisms and other such loyalties that factor into politics when you import people from overseas and act like they aren't different. Those will play out whether or not you want to ignore them. And no, Shabana Mahmood's not English either. George Orwell didn't think so, and she keeps quoting Orwell. Orwell would have looked at the photograph of Shabana Mahmood standing in the Home Office, and rather than recognise her as British as you and me, he'd think we'd lost a war.
Saying, I'm English because I feel like it and I've never felt anything else. So you've got a kind of ethno-nationalist wing of this argument who think it comes down to race or DNA in some size, shape or form. And their criticism of the civic nationalists, which is where I would place the two of us, and probably most of this audience, is it's not.
Starkey says sort of, though, and that's important. It's not ethno-nationalists versus civic nationalists as a false binary. It is reality versus liberal mysticism. Because ethno-nationalist is a redundant word, because ethnos and nation, ethnos is just the Greek version of the Latin natio, and both of them mean people, ethnic group, tribe, or the sort of, even to the biblical version of nation, which means like collection of family of families, which means that membership of the nation, the people, the ethnic group, the English, is by ancestry, heritage, ethnicity. And that's just a factor of reality. It's not an ideology you can neatly package as ethno-nationalism and go, ooh, isn't that scary? It's basically Hitler, so we have to pretend that anyone can self-ID as English, as if, just like the trans argument, you know, men can stick on a dress and call themselves a woman, otherwise you're basically the Nazis, which is what Mark is doing there, just with a more reserved, very, very intelligent, ooh, isn't that interesting posture. It's the flip side of the snobbishness that you would see on Have I Got News For You, or Mock the Week, where they would go, but the Tories, aren't you so retrograde? Big eyebrow raise and smug smirk. It's basically just trying to create a social stigma around things that are obviously true to force you, under pressure, to say, well, yes, I would quite like to subscribe to the world as you would like it to be, even though that's never going to happen because you're denying basic facts. And so civic nationalism is just a form of liberal globalism that says anyone from anywhere can identify as being English because they like the Queen and cricket, I suppose. And sorry, it's just not true. So I'm not going to lie to be polite, especially because those lies have enabled all sorts of horrors to befall our civilization because they've been conducted by importing people in the hope they just become one of us, even though they announce ahead of time they have no intent to be, and through their violent actions they show that they cannot be, will not be, and should be returned home.
Not quite that, really. It's not a question of the colour of your skin, for example, about whether we would let you into this country or not. It's something else. But then the riposte comes, okay, so what is it then? If English is just about feeling English, it's a bit like the trans thing, isn't it? You know, I wake up tomorrow morning, I decide I want to be a woman. Can people wake up tomorrow morning, decide they want to be English? So, again, taking a few steps forward in designing an immigration policy, for example, or a pathway to citizenship, that will need to have within it a clever, detailed and accepted understanding of what constitutes Britishness.
AKA, okay, you can be a trans woman as long as you pass. Like if you shave your legs and you get your boobs done and you grow your hair out. Basically, Mark Littlewood thinks Blair White is a woman. That's according to his own logic, right? And therefore, I don't know, the black chap that shows up to Brexit rallies in a Union Jack suit, basically, you know, as English as Winston Churchill. No, obviously not. He might be a nice guy, again, but he's just not. Okay? Can we accept facts, please? And so what the frustrating thing is here, again, I've already watched this clip. I just had to do it because I watched it and basically crashed out. Okay? Never crash out on the internet, but I was very, very close. Who among us... The problem that Professor Starkey has with this clip, and this is something we're going to have to go over in our sequel, because this is the crux of the issue, the ethnic identity, the ancestry issue. The problem Professor Starkey has in this clip is he says that he's not a full-bore civic nationalist, but then describes membership of being English or British as an emotional attachment to English history and the Constitution, shorn entirely of Christianity, by the way, because Professor Starkey grew up in a Quaker home, which isn't Christian anyway, and so he has an instinctive aversion to Christianity. He's also a gay man, so you know that produces some problems there. And even though Christianity produced, you know, common law, our constitutional settlement, banned cousin marriage, so it allowed us to think individualistically. It created our small family land holdings and farms. And that created the countryside. And so all the things that Starkey likes about England rest on Christian givens that he cannot guarantee. And then he treats Christianity as if it is synonymous with any other religion that can be neatly compartmentalized, even though those religions are either particular to tribes and ethnic groups like Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, or they have an imperial ambition like Islam, and so you have to marshal all the forces of the state just to try to keep it contained. So you're fighting constant battle against the entropic force of a foreign civilization that has been brought here that desires conquest and will not rest, rather than just removing them. It doesn't make any sense to me. But point being, Professor Starkey pushes back on the idea that he is a civic nationalist, and then, in final analysis, describes being British or English as basically a feeling, like a love of the common law and the Constitution, and learning about history to the extent that he has. And I'm sorry, that's just not the case. Like, babies, before they develop a love of English history and heritage, before they know what the Magna Carta is, are they English? How? By heritage.
In order to give people a pathway into the country, which might be to be here for a few years or indefinitely, or ultimately to get citizenship. So if it isn't ethnically based, what is it?
It is, how can I say, the standard historian's response, it's more complicated than either of them.
It's not. Sorry, it's not. Like, if you want to build a nice country, a functioning country, it's more complicated. You need to revere your own history, your own heritage. You need to have an understanding of it. You need to participate in weaving the social fabric that you have inherited. But actually, the category of English is not more complicated than, do you have an English parent or not?
Also best actually to begin with history. There is no such thing as a British nation. How can there be? The first football internationals, you know, were between England and Scotland.
Nations are ethnic groups. So the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish are native peoples to the British Isles. You can name the landmass to which they are indigenous. We have had 1,000 years of ethnic continuity until 1948. There was less immigration between 1066 and the Second World War than there has been since 1997. So this period of cultural confusion and ethnic discombobulation is an anachronism compared to the millennia of homogeneity that we enjoyed, that produced our high trust society, our uncharacteristic peace. Victorian Britain was more peaceful than modern Afghanistan. And our prosperity that led to our world-spanning empire, our humanitarian efforts, the Industrial Revolution. We, the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, could trace, as of 1927, almost 100 years ago now, our ancestry back to 927, when King Athelstan, the first king of all of England, defeated the last Viking settlement. We could trace our lineage back there with 90% of the population. So only 10% of the population in 1927 did not have a direct ancestor back to 1927. That is unheard of. That is a level of continuity that other nations do not have, even though we consider them peoples. Like, for example, the Hungarians consider themselves 85% Magyar. Now, they have ethnic minorities dispersed around neighbouring nations, and have, because they are a landlocked European country, have had quite a high level of population churn due to various invasions and being incorporated as part of various empires like the Prussians, the Austro-Hungarians, then of course the evil Soviet Union. And yet we still consider the Hungarians a nation and a people. So why don't we get the same consideration? It's actually not that complicated. Like, the history that Professor Starkey is so learned in is ours, which is why there is the prefix British or English. That denotes possession by a people.
As separate nations. We are the product of repeated fusion, the expansion of England by conquest, in the case of first Ireland, sort of, and then Wales, and then with Scotland, failure of conquest, and union by agreement between two countries with, although they shared language, well, sort of, if you listen very hard, and at that point religion, nevertheless had an extraordinarily different history and different sets of traditions. And I think that Britishness was usually for export. There was a British Empire abroad, but you were Scots, you were English, you were Welsh, or whatever at home. And it's really important to understand that even with the Act of Union of England and Scotland in 1707, Scotland retains all the features of a separate nation, with the exception of a separate crown. The crown had already been fused in 1604 with the death of Elizabeth, and a separate parliament, which is fused in 1707. Otherwise, Scotland retains a different branch of Christianity, Presbyterianism. The monarch even changes religion when he or she goes north of the border. You have a separate educational system. You have a separate legal system. You have notoriously separate notes.
But you have a genetically proximate, near-identical people. Which means that the software can change, but it's running on the same hardware. Like, again, you can't run Scottish software on Gujarat hardware. Or Mirpuri clan hardware. So, I enjoy these historical conversations with Professor Starkey, and again, I have nothing but the utmost respect for him. He's an absolute gentleman. very cordial to me in our discussion. I'll link the full thing down in the description. But this is all beside the point if we're ethnically replaced. Because the replacements won't be having these conversations about our history, because it won't be their history. They will just, per camp of the saints, our universe means nothing to them. They won't understand. They are simply tired and cold, and will make firewood out of the oak doors that comprise our civilization.
You have a separate order of chivalry. Going out of my head. Is it St Andrew's Thistle? That's right. What a barbarous thing to name an order after. But anyway, the Thistle, as opposed to the Garter, yes, which is a good joke. A separate system of heraldry, a separate courts. So the whole, in other words, union with Scotland did not in any way make Scotland English, or ever try to make it English. But what I think did, and indeed...
Then nobody that is imported here can become English. If the Scots can't become English despite being very genetically proximate, being native to these isles, our border with them essentially being a product of Hadrian's Wall, you know, it's not like it's a hard geographic border, right? Still same isle. If they can't become English, then how can everyone from everywhere, from all over the world that have lived in isolation from us for the last few thousand years until the HMS Windrush and commercial flight? Just not going to happen. And I'm putting that position forward. That position is latent in Professor Starkey's supposition. That's the logic of it. But Mark Littlewood doesn't agree with that. So, what are we doing here?
If you look at the policy of the Crown and government after Union, there were a few shots at saying Scotland is really North Britain. If you actually look, the example I always give, because I actually played John Worthington in The Importance of Being Earnest, you get it there. You may remember John Worthington had 3 addresses, and Lady Bracknell congratulates him at that point, and he reveals his London address, whatever number it was, Belgrave Square. Oh, the wrong side of Belgrave Square. And then somewhere or another in Surrey, and the foreign, the sporran, Fifeshire, North Britain, you know, the Scottish address. But there was very, very little of that. And the royal family gives all princes titles in England and Scotland, and then in Ireland, and then even in Wales. Wales catches up at the end of the late 19th century. Under Lloyd George, you invent Cardiff as capital. So you have, what makes Britain so extraordinary is, even, this is the point about whiteness, even when we were white, we were in one sense not multicultural, or maybe yes to an extent, and certainly multinational.
Okay, so we agree that it's not just being white that determines your membership of a people, an ethnic group. Because the Albanians are white, the English are white, and we're very different as all the Albanian gangsters coming over to our country and taking the piss out of the natives, taking all of our tax money, would show. Don't wrong, the French are white, and they've managed to be one of our oldest foes, though at this time where we're facing civilizational erasure. I think, as Eric Zamore told Carl Benjamin once, I think it's time for the oldest of enemies to become the closest of friends. No more brother wars. Nevertheless, okay, so we agree that it's not just about being white. Being white is actually an incidental factor of being English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish. Because it just so happens that all of the families that comprise the nations of English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, that comprise the union of nations, that is the United Kingdom or the British Isles, they were white. So membership of that family of families is how you become English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish. And that is to whom the culture belongs, and that is why that culture is second nature to most of them. That is why, when Professor Starkey talks about history and culture, it is a self-evident good to him because it accords with his preferences and prejudices, because he has grown up in a very English environment. Because throughout his upbringing, Britain was upwards of 99% white British. It's only until very recently that that has changed. And so, of course, British history and culture is self-evidently good to Professor Starkey, but it's not to the newcomers, and it won't be because it's not their preferences, it's not their prejudices, it's not their families. And given organic intermarriage rates at much more mixed societies than ours, like, for example, the United States, only ever top out about 8 to 10%, I don't see those families marrying each other's families anytime soon. And even if they did at large scales, you're not going to get the same culture at the end of it. So I'm sorry, it's just not very desirable. Just trying to enculturate these people into our way of life just isn't going to work. And so it might make for an interesting hypothetical conversation sat in a public event, but it has no bearing on the real world when we're staring down the gun barrel of demographic obsolescence. And that seems like the more pressing issue, because if we do become demographically a minority in our own country, we won't even be able to have these conversations anymore, because we will be persecuted by the newcomers, and civilization will be so unstable, it'll be like South Africa or Lebanon or Yugoslavia. And so we won't have the level of peace and high trust required for such interesting, polite conversations to be held.
Genuinely
Well, this is
work.
unusual for a European
It's
nation.
unique.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, except the old empires were.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
You see, we weren't an empire. But there was something that was very important, and this is what comes in. So, what was the British bit? The British bit was that first the elites, and then everybody else, except in the wild failure of Ireland, buys in to the basic political system of England. That's what happened. And in case of the elites went to English public schools and whatever. In other words, the multinationalism of Britain could only work if, contrary to multiculturalism, you recognized one element as being superior, the defining element, which is Englishness. Now, that doesn't mean it's Morris dancing, it doesn't mean you to do St. George, it means that broad acceptance of the political characteristics that we've been talking about that Blair did his best to undo. And
Okay, my identity is not purely a political settlement. I agree that that political settlement, that legal system, that model of parliamentary governance is superior, but I don't agree that my identity is the sum total of those institutions. And I understand that Professor Starkey is a Whig because he believes that old Whiggishness is real conservatism, as he told me. And so he believes that a nation is the sum total of its institutions which unfurl the I don't want to say ideology, but I don't even want to say philosophy because he doesn't believe in philosophy. Let's say just say culture and prejudices and preferences of that people onto that people to shape and mold them over time. The problem is institutions are staffed by people. The institutions themselves are not neutral, and therefore even the institutions and the culture come from the people. And so if the people are substituted out, you don't get the institutions, you don't get the culture, you don't get the nation anymore. So this is a fundamental flaw. You know, saying the institutions are the important thing puts the cart before the horse. And also, the problem with Professor Starkey's vision here, as he's going to say in a minute, is that you don't have to compartmentalize or even renounce your own ethnic culture and religion to recognize the supremacy of the English political system. So what you're basically arguing for is running a mini empire within the British Isles. You're arguing for the hybridization of foreign peoples with a legal, political British identity. I'm sorry, that's just not going to work. Like, that's basically the Ottoman millet system, and I don't want that. Because we didn't have that, and we had a much better country when we didn't have that. And so why can't we just revert to the country we had, which is possible, because the country we've got now is a consequence of political choices, and so we can just make different political choices and get rid of all of the people who are troublesome and don't fit in. Why can't we just revert to the country we had, rather than have to become like a dysfunctional Singapore, or or a British Empire within Britain. And again, it's annoying because Professor Starkey and I basically already went over this in our discussion, and it just feels like that had no impact. So maybe a part 2 is warranted. But as Dave Green recently said, a lot of discussions about immigration at the moment are just trying to get people to unlearn the blank slate over and over, and it really feels like it here, because the thing that isn't admitted in this conversation is that this entire conversation is pointless once you realize that demographic change precedes cultural change, and therefore demographics are an intractable, concrete problem. And so this entire conversation has no purpose if you don't stop the demographic change, which the parties that both Professor Starkey and Mark Littlewood are signed up to, the Conservatives and Reform, won't.
It seems to me that is a tradition which anybody would really want to enter.
Of course it seems that way to you, Professor Starkey, because you're English. But it's not so self-evident to random Indians who would like to, enter our prosperous high trust system and replace all the members of a company with their ethnic kin from overseas and Hinduize it. So no, it's not self-evident to everyone around the world that the English political system is preferable, because the entire world is not Englishmen in waiting. And you can tell that because when clustered together in sufficient numbers, such as countries, they all act a certain way, despite having the supposedly, in the Whig conception, universally preferable, accessible political and philosophical ideals ready to hand. Like, if they really are self-evidently preferable to everyone, why don't we just, give them an instruction manual for setting up an English parliament and just allow India to have that rather than just import Indians? Why isn't every country around the world just like England, if it really is so self-evidently preferable to everyone? And that's because it isn't. It's just self-evidently preferable to you because you're a well-learned Englishman who grew up around Englishmen. And so you're making the mistake of thinking that everyone basically thinks like you when they don't.
Just before we come over to the audience, because I'm sure there'll be some questions.
No, can't get you.
But
can we just
very
elaborate?
Very quickly, because we're on the clock.
Yeah.
The bit about this is, do the electorate see it in that constitutional way? I mean, that's a really interesting history lesson. Of course, you can then see, as you brilliantly explained, that Britain is unlike any other country. But the sort of problem you've got when you press a Brit who even says, I'm a very patriotic Brit, I love my country, and I only want people to come here who are simpatico. And then you press, well, what is that exactly? And you get a kind of, well, it's sort of, I guess, a kind of sense of fair play and sort of freedom and sort of a bit of, equal treatment under the law, and it sort of probably helps, but isn't necessary if you love warm beer and cricket. Would be a sort of tick in the box. And before you know it, you're into something incredibly vague. It may be heartfelt, and it may even be important, but
Exactly, Mark. Exactly. If you adopt the frame that anyone can become British because being British or English is a set of feelings or affinity for a political system or pastimes or warm beer and cricket, then you end up in an indefensible position sounding just like Keir Starmer or Zach Polanski. This is why people are so frustrated with Nigel Farage, where he says being English is not a matter of breaking out the DNA test and finding out if you have Anglo-Saxon ancestry. It's about how you feel and what your priorities are. And actually, no, I agree with demographer Paul Morland on this, who himself is not English. I mean, he's Jewish and lives in England all his life, but acknowledges he's not English, despite having English characteristics. He says that being a nation is the myth of common ancestry validated by modern scientific DNA testing. We can actually find out whether or not you're English using a 23andMe. So this entire conversation is besides the point. And as Mark says, the moment that you try to press someone on what constitutes this Scout's pledge of becoming British, it moves straight back, it retreats into vagaries. And so it's an indefensible position. The only defensible position, as I put below this video, the only defensible definition of Englishness is whether or not you have English ancestry. And any other definition is just untenable, I'm afraid.
My God, it's difficult to define.
Yes, it is difficult to define. You see, I want to talk about what I call, we have this disaster of multiculturalism, and multiculturalism is a disaster. We should be talking about biculturalism, people having two cultures, which is why in some ways, with all our problems with immigration, we've got the most successful record in Europe. That's to say, looking at the groups that have done it, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Chinese, generally speaking, have been able to do what Scots and Welsh and Irish did.
Sorry, but that's an insane thing to say. You're missing some very big groups there, especially if you're comparing to Europe, such as the Pakistanis that have gang raped, murdered, trafficked, and tortured potentially millions of British children. And I know Professor Starkey opposes that. But you can't just omit that and then say, well, we're relatively successful compared to the Europeans. Actually, we're not. We're a lot worse. We are in demographic dire straits here. And as far as the groups that Professor Starkey names, I mean, they haven't all fit in seamlessly either. The number one nation for sexual crimes, not per capita, but as in, like, a gross producer of sex offenders is India. And they're not all Muslim. They're Sikh and Hindu too, and that's because of the high rates of cousin and child marriage that go on there, the lower IQs and lower impulse control. It's because they have a ethnocentric, ethnically chauvinistic, collectivist culture and morality system. They believe in Izzat, face saving, basically like XP farming social credit at the expense of you. It's a zero-sum game. So, you know, being polite to you is only of a benefit if it grants them social standing, whereas they can lie, cheat, and steal and screw you over so long as it gives them social standing. That's not how the English think. So that hasn't been as seamless as you say. But also, it just seems to me we're playing fast and loose with words here because, okay, we don't need multiculturalism, we need biculturalism. Okay, and what's that biculturalism? You have a British identity, and then you have whatever other identity you feel like. Okay, so within that bicultural category, you have multiculturalism. So you have Judaism and Hinduism and Sikhism and Christianity and, as Professor Starkey said in our long conversation, some sort of state-endorsed version of Islam. So you have multiculturalism within the biculturalism. So you still have multiculturalism. Sorry, this is just cope. I don't want to be rude to the professor, but this is not going to work. We don't have time for this.
That's to say, to preserve their own separate identities culturally, but to form a valuable constituent part of this broader political culture, which has its own very definite rules. And we all know the groups that haven't. And it seems to me one very important thing is some people can do it quickly. Others will be more slow. Others may indeed not be able to do it at all. So one.
Okay. But do what? Because Southall and areas of West London and even areas of the Midlands and where you have large Hindu settlements, they're not recognisably British. You've got street signs in Punjabi. You've got the tube signs in random squiggles that you would see from Star Wars. That's not English. That's not an effective example of integration. That's a colony. And so even if they're not actively committing violence against the native population, that is still taking over our country, extracting resources from it and sending it to the motherland in remittances, and infiltrating our political parties and electing their own ethnic representatives in the form of Rishi Sunak or Priti Patel, or increasingly the number of ethnic minority and actual foreign national candidates in Reform UK. So no, I don't agree that these people are doing anything substantive to add to our country more than just abiding by the law and paying taxes, which seems to be the extent of the British identity that both Professor Starkey and Mark Littlewood conceive of. And I'm sorry, it's a lot more than that. And it's also to be defined by the native people themselves. And so why should we have to put up with a longer timescale of integration of groups that we never wanted here in the first place? Because the population always voted against immigration, legal and illegal. Still, a vast majority of the population want every illegal immigrant deported, and 45%, according to a recent YouGov poll, want large numbers of legal migrants to go, with particular emphasis on Islam, though they're not too keen about like loads of Africans yelling into speakerphone or Indians spitting pan on the streets in London and staining shop fronts orange either. Sorry, I'm not willing to just wait it out and see what happens, because I know at the end of it, even if it's done peacefully, my country will not be the same. It won't be the same as the country that David Starkey grew up in and seems to cherish. So, pointless conversation.
One of the other things we need to introduce is the idea of time. Because remember, many people that we think of as being absolutely English have names like de la Billière, the former commander of armed forces, who was, of course, his family were French Huguenots.
Christian, European, ethnically proximate. Came in very small numbers of like 1,000, largely intermarried with the native population, and that's why you don't have any French Huguenot lobbying groups demanding more French Huguenot representation. You do have that with Indians, with Muslims, even with Jews, which is Professor Starkey's preferred example of successful integration. They still live in sequestered sectarian colonies, or they demand specific representation and taxpayer redistribution to protect and advantage their in-group. Sorry, I just don't... I don't think that the British state should be umpire over a series of competing and conflicting ethnic and religious tribes. We didn't succeed by being like that, and other nations have failed because they have been like that for millennia.
And time erodes. Time shifts. But I think if we get this idea of, and again, one of the reasons, Mark, we're in this terrible mess is that because of the Race Relations Act of 68, because of the general allergy to discussing anything of these questions, we haven't talked about these things. It's been politically toxic to talk about them. And this is a spectacular illustration of the fact that what Parliament means is talk. The need to have the free right of discussion and debate about the more sensitive the topic, the more generally it should be talked about. We've done exactly the opposite.
Douglas Murray once said something interesting to me, and he said, "I'd make a terrible politician because, much like Enoch Powell, I pursue ideas to their logical endpoint, and therefore I am not amenable to short-term compromise." But I'm sorry, if we recognise Enoch Powell was right, in fact he underestimated the scale and origin source of the problem with his rivers of blood speech, then compromise be damned. This system of centrist squeamishness that has delivered, I mean, the complete desolation of our country. The high streets are a state, public services are crumbling, and also just millions of foreigners with no right to be here, just destroying our social fabric. If we recognise that that model of parliamentary concession and compromise and, oh, we can't do that, minister, because it'll upset the courts or the media. If we recognise that they were wrong and Enoch Powell was right, why do we have to compromise? Why can't we just do the difficult thing, even if it makes men like Mark Littlewood uncomfortable?
Fascinating. I love this idea that the way of seeing, and I really hope this is an idea you're going to develop, David, because when you and I first discussed it, it really caught my attention at first blush. And what could be more British than an approach to citizenship that involves everybody having, if you like, a double-barreled citizenship?
Exactly.
So I'm sort of British English. I had an interesting chat yesterday with Suella Braverman, and
what could be more British? Actually being fucking British. This is just absurd. Anyway, look, we'll finish this.
So I said, how do you identify? I said, I'm not English, I'm British Asian.
Exactly.
You could see others identifying themselves as British Indian, for the sake of argument. Lots of British Welsh, lots of British Scottish. I think that's a really interesting approach to the issue.
Just saying it's interesting or just nodding and saying yes, yes, yes doesn't mean it's true. Like, just affirming something. This reminds me of the sort of insufferable Democrat campaign tweets from about 2 to 4 years ago, where they would just repeat a slogan over and over again with a clapping emoji, like trans rights are human rights, trans rights are human rights. British Asians are as British as you and me. British Asians, they're not. Sorry, they're just not. They might be really nice people. Like, I quite like Suella Braverman, actually. I've met her a couple of times. She seems to try and do the right thing. Wasn't very successful as a Home Secretary. And she has the humility of saying, look, I'm not English. But to turn around and say, oh yeah, this is a really desirable settlement. Everyone just has a hyphenated identity. Nothing could be more British than that. Actually, yeah, they could be English, Scottish, Welsh, or Irish. Like, you've set the criteria of being most British as being in some way not British. It's just a category error. It's not going to work. It's not going to produce a cohesive, recognizable civilization, and it's just not true. This is the fundamental problem I have with it. The space between the world you would like to build, the sort of compromise you're trying to make with the fractured ethno-cultural settlement we inherited, and the world as it actually is. There is space between them. There's less space than between that and what the Green Party or Labour are trying to build, but there is still space. And in that space, there are problems. You want them as one-to-one as possible. And so that means recognizing uncomfortable facts. Like, the British people are a collection of ethnic groups, and ethnic groups are families of families. And if you don't have the heritage of that given family, you're not a part of that group. You might be a nice person, you might hold a British passport because of a legal anachronism that happened in the 20th century. Doesn't mean you can't live here if you're an adopted family member. Let's say if you marry into the tribe, or if you're a friend who reveres our history and the people that own the country. Like Firaz Modad or Noria Khan or Stelios or a number of my foreign friends. Doesn't mean that they can't stay in the 5% of the country that don't necessarily need to have indigenous heritage. But that doesn't make them British. It doesn't make them English, Scottish, Welsh or Irish. And there's no reason why we should keep pretending that they can. If anything, there's a reason to the contrary, because pretending has enabled all sorts of horrors to happen under the auspices of, well, we can just wait and see and eventually time will make them British. It won't.
Issue that the British is the overriding thing in terms of how the law would work, and your identity is what's written after the hyphen. And that might be a way in which, so it may not be multiculturalism because everybody's got to have the British at the first point.
There's a primacy.
There's a primacy.
Is the acknowledgement of primacy, but it's also the acknowledgement of the private sphere. I mean, this idea first struck me way back in the 1990s when I was on the Moral Maze, and Hugo Gryn and I had a very tense relationship. He was the rabbi of the Reformed West London congregation, and there were wonderful exchanges like Hugo, who had one of these voices that goes down there and accounts for men getting prostates, and David, you're not half as nasty as you seem. And my responding, fluting voice deliberately, and Hugo, dear, and not half as nice as you appear either. But he did this extraordinary thing. He invited me and my late gay partner, of course, to the Passover. I have never, in his house, I have never, ever forgotten it. That whole world in which this man that I just knew as a fellow contestant in public life turned into a high priest in his own household.
Okay, and at Passover, Jewish identity and customs are centered, they are supreme, and you don't become Jewish by participating in it. So, again, this entire conversation is... I think we'll just finish it here. Just saying, oh, we're not having multiculturalism, you can just retain your culture, identity, and faith as long as you declare yourself British. Yeah, that is multiculturalism. That's the same the same doctrine that David Cameron put forth in his Munich Security Conference address in like 2010 when he declared multiculturalism is dead and then set about filling the Conservative Party with Muslims. Like, sorry, it's infuriating. It feels like the identity and immigration conversation is just circling the drain at this point, and those of us who recognise that national identity is a product of ancestry, are just repeating that point till we're blue in the face to people who are just trying to cope and find a workaround and concede even a little bit of the narrative to people who would like to see our identity and our country driven to extinction. And it's like, no, sorry, I'm not going to use the pronouns to autogynephiles. I'm not going to indulge your delusion. And in the same way, I'm not going to call someone who's British who isn't. So anyway, look, I look forward to the eventual part 2 that Professor Starkey and I do. I hope it's in person next time because it's a lot easier than just respectively monologuing into our webcams. I'll leave our first part down in the description, but if we keep having to have this conversation over and over, and just, you know, telling people, no, obviously you can't just become British by self-identifying, I'm just going to crash out.